Before prisons had walls, before courts pretended to be fair, the Middle Ages made one brutal promise: not everyone deserved to survive. In a world ruled by crowns, crosses, and cold iron, life was not protected by innocence. It was weighed by usefulness, bloodline, and obedience. A single accusation could erase a name. A whispered rumor could become a death sentence. Justice was not blind. It was watching very closely, and it remembered who you were born to, who you served, and who you had offended. Some were spared, not because they were right, but because they were powerful. Others were destroyed, not because they were guilty, but because their existence was inconvenient. Tonight's story is not about monsters or myths. It is about real men and women who lived under laws designed to decide who was allowed to live and who could be erased without consequence. Decisions made behind stone walls. Judgments delivered by trembling hands that still held power. And a system where mercy was rarer than death. If you want deeply researched, emotionally intense history, subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this were never meant to be forgotten. In the winter of 1314, the stone hall of Paris smelled of damp wool, ink, and fear. Men whispered, not out of reverence, but survival. The Middle Ages did not execute people loudly at first. It began quietly, with paperwork, testimony, and the slow tightening of power around a single name. On that morning, the name was Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, once one of the most powerful men in Christendom. To the public, the Templars were warriors of God. To King Philip, the Fourth of France, they were a problem. They held land, gold, influence, and worse, independence. Philip was deeply in debt to them, and medieval law had a convenient solution for creditors who could not be repaid. Declare them enemies of God. Guilt did not need proof. It needed usefulness. The arrests came before dawn. Templar knights were pulled from beds, chapels, and armories. No charges were read, no defense allowed. Their lives were frozen in place by royal decree. In medieval Europe, survival was not a right. It was a privilege granted by those who ruled. Interrogations followed a familiar pattern. Confess, and you might live. Resist, and you would not. The methods were legal. Torture was not a scandal. It was procedure. Stretching racks, suffocating hoods, starvation cells. Confessions were written before they were spoken. Men broke not because they were guilty, but because pain redefined truth. Jacques de Molay confessed, then retracted, then confessed again. Each version sealed his fate further. In medieval justice, inconsistency was not evidence of coercion. It was proof of corruption. Once the system marked you as expendable, every word you spoke worked against you. But this was not just about one order. Across Europe, the same logic ruled daily life. A peasant accused of theft against a noble rarely survived trial. A woman accused of adultery could be buried alive. A servant accused of treason against his lord could be executed without testimony. Law followed hierarchy, not morality. In England, trial by ordeal still lingered in memory. Boiling water, hot iron. If God spared you, you were innocent. If you burned, drowned, or died, the verdict was clear. Survival itself became evidence of divine approval. Justice outsourced responsibility to faith and washed its hands of blood. Even when ordeals faded, their spirit remained. Courts favored oaths over facts. Who swore against you mattered more than what they said. A noble's word outweighed a dozen peasants. Blood carried credibility. Birth decided value. Inside castles and monasteries, councils debated not innocence, but consequences. Would this execution stabilize the region? Would this pardon anger the crown? Would this death silence unrest? Human life was weighed like currency. If killing one man saved 100 from rebellion, the math was considered holy. Some tried to navigate the system with submission. Others fought it with silence. Both strategies often failed. The medieval world rewarded loyalty until loyalty became inconvenient. Then it erased you. By 1314, the Templars were finished, their properties seized, their names dragged through sermons. Jacques de Molay stood imprisoned, aging, stripped of command. The Church offered him one last mercy: reaffirm his confession publicly and die quietly. Instead, he spoke differently. On March 18th, 1314, before a watching crowd, de Molay recanted everything. He declared the Templars innocent. He accused the court of lies. In that moment, he crossed the final line. Medieval justice could forgive sin, but never defiance. The sentence was immediate: death by fire, that same evening. No appeal, no delay. The system had made its choice. As flames rose around him, witnesses recorded his final words, not as prophecy, but as accusation. He named the king. He named the pope. He declared that God would judge them soon. What history remembers next is unsettling, not because it is mystical, but because it is real. Within the year, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV were dead. And suddenly, the question that haunted medieval Europe returned with terrifying clarity. Had justice been served, or had power simply miscalculated the cost of deciding who was allowed to live? The answer would not bring peace. It would bring something far worse. The deaths of King Philip IV and Pope Clement V did not bring justice. They brought silence, the most dangerous outcome of all. No one reopened the trials. No one restored the dead. The medieval system did not collapse under the weight of its mistakes. It adapted, refined, and continued. Because the Middle Ages were never truly about law, they were about permission. Who was permitted to speak? Who was permitted to accuse? Who was permitted to survive? Across Europe, the machinery that destroyed the Templars remained intact. Kings learned they could weaponize courts. The Church learned it could bless violence without blood on its hands. And ordinary people learned a devastating lesson. Survival depended less on truth than on alignment. In Florence, decades later, a banker named Cecco d'Ascoli was accused of heresy. His crime was not treason or murder, but knowledge. He wrote about astronomy, questioned divine order, and spoke too freely in a world that punished curiosity. He was warned. He recanted publicly. It did not save him. His usefulness had expired. He was burned alive in 1327, not because he was dangerous, but because he was uncontrollable. This was the quiet rule of medieval justice. Repentance could delay death, but it rarely prevented it. In rural villages, justice was even colder. Manorial courts held power over peasants' lives. A lord could order execution for theft, disobedience, or rumor of rebellion. Trials were brief. Evidence was optional. Punishment was public. The goal was not fairness, it was fear, and fear worked. People learned to accuse before they were accused, to remain invisible, to survive by obedience. Communities turned inward, watching each other closely, knowing that silence could be read as guilt. Women bore the weight of this system most brutally. Accusations of adultery, infertility, or disobedience could end in execution or lifelong exile. In some regions, a woman's testimony was legally worth half that of a man, unless she was accusing another woman, in which case it suddenly mattered. The law bent to preserve hierarchy. Even nobles were not immune. Power did not guarantee life, it merely delayed judgment. Princes who fell from favor vanished into towers. Dukes accused of treason were quietly strangled. Royal blood spilled without ceremony when it threatened succession. The Middle Ages were ruthless to everyone, but merciless to those who misread their position. The system was self-justifying. Death was framed as order. Punishment was framed as mercy. Execution was framed as protection of the realm, and the people accepted it because the alternative, questioning authority, often ended the same way. What made medieval justice so effective was not its brutality, but its ambiguity. There were no clear villains. Judges believed they were preserving peace. Kings believed they were chosen by God. Priests believed salvation required sacrifice. Everyone involved could tell themselves they were doing the right thing, and that is why it lasted. But cracks did appear. In England, juries slowly replaced ordeals. In some cities, written law began to matter more than birth. Appeals became possible, not common, but imaginable. These were not revolutions. They were adjustments. The system learned that survival required appearing fair, not being fair. By the late Middle Ages, executions became more symbolic, trials more elaborate. Paper replaced iron, but the core question remained unchanged. Who gets to decide whose life has value? The answer was still power. What history rarely tells you is this: medieval justice did not disappear. It evolved. Modern courts inherited its structure. Governments inherited its language. Institutions inherited its ability to define guilt before evidence. The Middle Ages were not uniquely cruel. They were simply honest about something later centuries tried to hide. That law is often a reflection of those who write it, not those who suffer under it. And the final twist is this: most people executed in the Middle Ages were not rebels, heretics, or criminals. They were ordinary individuals caught at the wrong intersection of power, fear, and ambition. Their names faded not because they were unimportant, but because remembering them would expose how fragile justice truly was. The Middle Ages decided who was allowed to live by answering a single question: is your existence more useful than your death? If the answer was no, the verdict was already written. The lesson is simple and uncomfortable. When justice serves power instead of truth, survival becomes a privilege, not a right. History does not repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself quietly through systems that look reasonable until they are tested. If stories like this matter to you, stories that reveal how the past still shapes who we are today, subscribe to the channel, because the most dangerous histories are the ones we think no longer apply.